Hello and welcome. I'm grateful to be here, and I'm grateful to be sharing a topic that intrigues me and has fascinated me for many years now. I want to actually start with a quote that is not from the Yoga Sutra. It's from Dora Kunz, who was the founder or developer of therapeutic touch. And although the words are a little different, I think the message and the essence of this quote is very, very much in tune with the Yoga Sutras. Every human being has an inner self, a consciousness at its highest or deepest level. And this inner self, our true self, is always the center of peace and quiet. When we get flashes of intuition or insight, we come closer to this inner self. But it is in meditation that we come the closest to our own true self. Let's start with two important ideas from the Yoga Sutra. The first is the meaning of your thoughts. How many thoughts do you have? It's said that we have about 4,000 a day. And that's about 4 a minute during the waking hours, which I think is actually quite low. They're not unique. They're actually very repetitious, and we tend to cycle thoughts over and over again. Do you know what kind of thoughts you have on a regular basis? It's really interesting to classify them and figure out, are you a planner? Do you go after past events and stay there? Do you think about things that make you anxious or perhaps sad events? Do you spark on joyful events? Are you making comparisons on a regular basis? That's a very common thing to do. And since this internal dialogue or our self-talk is part of how we think, it's important, and it's also how we string our personality together. So many years ago, William James coined the phrase stream of consciousness. Our internal dialogue is how we narrate our life to ourselves. Oftentimes, we're narrating our life without actually experiencing it. There's a friend who has a sign in her office that says, "Don't believe everything you think." And I think that's so true. Yeah. We don't have to believe everything we think, but we seldom really examine what we think, and we seldom identify what is real in what we think and what is not. So one definition of an advanced stage of consciousness is the progressive freedom from this narrative in our head. And the Yoga Sutras has many things to say about this. The second thing I want to emphasize is that yoga is about practice. And without the practice, there is no yoga. We can learn mountains and read Sanskrit and have all of these ideas, but if we don't practice, it's not yoga. So it would feel, for me personally, uneasy to talk about yoga without at least spending a minute or two centering. So if you'd like, join me. Take a moment. Inhale and exhale with awareness of your breath all the way down into your belly. Notice how you breathe in. Everyone is different. Every breath is a little bit different. If you feel comfortable, just raise your shoulders, roll your shoulders back and down. A seat of stress for many of us. Note the taste in your mouth. Have a sense of how your feet touch the floor or hanging in the air. What touches the soles of your feet? And then for a moment, turn your attention to your thoughts that we were just talking about. Sometimes when you turn your attention to your thoughts, they actually go away for a moment. And then they return. I like to think of thoughts as being identifiable just as thoughts. And then letting them get heavy so they just sink. That was a thought, and then it sinks. Take a moment in silence, finding a place inside of you that is already quieter. The Yoga Sutras has a lot to say about that place of center and quiet in us. Hundreds of years before the Yoga Sutra was compiled, the Upanishads and earlier texts explain that the uncontrolled mind is like an unruly horse. It's running wild and free. But through yoga, a person can harness this unruly horse, conquer the mind, become master of the senses, attain heaven, and become spirit itself. One of my favorite books is by Wayne Muller, who asks the question on the title, "How then shall we live?" He gives another apt analogy for our unruly mind, which is that our mind is like the trunk of an elephant. And in India, in the large temples, many of them have a compound, and sometimes elephants lived in these compounds as temple elephants. And during processions, during feast days or festivals, they would be dressed and colored, and they would be expected to walk through the streets. If you've ever been to an older Indian city, you know the streets are narrow and windy. There are many things around. There are booths and stalls and colors and lights. And if you were an elephant walking through those streets, it would be very difficult to not bump into things, to not reach for the bananas, to not create chaos by your very presence. And so the wise caretakers of the elephants would take a small stick, maybe a small bamboo stick, and put it in the trunk for the elephant to hold. So the elephant had focus as it walked through the streets. The Yoga Sutra tells us how to focus and how to create that quiet. And in my own words, I think about yoga as being about the intention. It definitely has intention and purpose. We'll talk a little bit about this. Intention and attention, where we put our energy, our power, our focus. So in this time together, we'll touch on the history and the goal of yoga. We'll touch on some of the practices. We'll touch on the ethics of yoga, of which they are the foundation. And then look at some of the ways that the Yoga Sutra tells us about living with ourselves and living with other people. And then a brief look at the third chapter, A Question of Human Powers. So why am I here? I brought you some old photographs. The first one is me about 30 years ago or longer, 35 years ago. I was working at a corporation. I was stressed. And although this truly isn't a photo of me, I appreciate the little red jagged lightning bolts coming out the side because that's what it felt like to me. And I totally stumbled into yoga, which was quite new at the time. And in what we've come to know in the US as yoga classes, which are primarily around the physical postures and the stretching and balance. And I fell into them, and it was so hard for me. It was hard to stay focused. It was hard to breathe. I had no awareness of my breath. It was so hard, and I am a little competitive, so I stuck with it. And I kept going, and I didn't understand it. And for many years, I never wanted to really understand the history and the philosophy. I picked up the Yoga Sutras a couple of times and looked at a few pages and then tossed it. Here's another photo of me, really not a photo of me, but several years later, because I did notice that when I did slow down, when I did practice and I had taken up meditation, I actually was a different person. And it engendered a change in career. I went back to school and moved from business to psychology. And during that time in studying psychology, I was fortunate to have somebody help me study the Yoga Sutras and the Samkhya Karakas. So that's how I ended up here. I tell you all of this because many people enter yoga through the postures. And some people think of them as not yoga. I think of them as a door in, and many times a very wonderful door into better health and a different experience. They're a facet of yoga. They're only a facet and sometimes a very small facet. The Yoga Sutras will tell us more. So what is yoga? As I said before, yoga is practice. So the theory is less important, although it is useful to have the theory. It's many practices. It's not a religion in itself, but it is part of Indian culture. And because I am not Hindu, I tried very hard to respect and honor the fact that it is a set of practices embedded in a culture. I think the ultimate goal of yoga is bigger than any one culture. However, I think it's universal. It's ultimately spiritual or higher consciousness, freedom, realization, enlightenment, all those words that all have a slightly different meaning, but connote that place and that experience that is really beyond words. I always feel odd using words to describe yoga because it is beyond words in many ways. The practices are varied. So we know about the physical practice. Many of you practice pranayama, which is that breathing, deliberate breathing, deliberately channeling life force. And of course, meditation. There are also practices around controlling sensations and practices around service, giving back, entering that space of understanding that we are all connected in some way. There are also practices about living daily life, choosing the right action, and then not getting caught up in the rebound of an action. The idea that we act and then we let it go rather than going back and looping for hours and days and weeks and time. These practices have spawned a vast literature. Some of the texts are older than the Yoga Sutras. Some are more recent. And some of the literature is about mindfulness. Now, that's a word in psychology that's used quite a lot today. There is a vast amount of research on mindfulness, and I sometimes go into companies and teach some of the research on mindfulness, because even fairly short practices can have profound effects on how people behave, how they react, how they feel, whether or not they're more empathetic. Isn't that an interesting way to think about how being mindful can affect us? Because there are practices under the title of mindfulness that are fairly prescribed, then they can be researched. And that contributes to our knowledge of health, physical health, and contributes to certainly mental health. However, the Yoga Sutra tells us that these practices have something more to them. Yoga itself is one of the 6 formal schools of philosophy in India. It's aligned with a philosophy called Sankhya. And in the classical form of Sankhya, the 2 principles, matter and pure consciousness, by their very proximity, the universe evolves. So the proximity of consciousness and matter produces everything that we know, from the universe to our senses and how we know the world. So that's the classical Sankhya, and the classical yoga is instead of an evolution, is an involution. It's coming back to that place where it's clear that there is matter and consciousness, and we are consciousness. So it's the inverse, if you will, and it's taking a return trip. Have you ever felt a longing to return? I don't mean to a particular place, though that may be true, but I get that internal longing to come back home to source, if you will, or God, perhaps. The power of wanting to return. And it's the question that yoga answers. How do we get there? Most Indian philosophy has a common set of principles, and I'll mention just a few. One is that life is suffering brought on by our desires, our attachments, our unfettered mind, our unruly horse, if you will. And we've confused our personality, our ego, with what Dora Kuntz in the very beginning called the inner self. I was with my father-in-law once, and we had just been with 2 people that I thought of as being very spiritual and very wise. And we had observed them fighting rather viciously, I would say, certainly very assertively. And when we came back, I asked him, he was very wise himself, and I asked him, what was that about? I mean, how could these 2 people I thought were so wise, how come they were fighting so viciously? And he said, it's not them, it's their personalities. And for me, that was a insight. I had never really thought about being anything other than who I am in this body. I mean, I had had some knowledge that maybe there was more, but that real getting it, if you will, that real knowledge that there was a personality and I was something else. The second commonality of these philosophies is that there are ways to be free of suffering, so we don't have to suffer. Third is that something internal reincarnates. This isn't true of all the philosophies, but it's true of most. And we live many lives in these reincarnations. What we do in this life and in past lives affects the future. And all of this happens through the law of karma. The last principle that's similar in many of these philosophies is something that I think is important for yoga, which is the realization, very hard to realize, that our thoughts are the same as our action. Most of us think our thoughts are done in the privacy of our own mind and hope that nobody ever really sees it. Well, you know, if you think about them as actions, then you want to clean up your mind, don't you? If everyone could see your thoughts, how would you want to change them? So what are the Yoga Sutras, this text that we're talking about? It's one of many texts on yoga. The Bhagavad Gita is probably more well-known and greatly beloved and much more, forgive me, Patanjali, but probably more interesting to read. You know, it's very beautiful and there's a lot of imagery in it. The Yoga Sutras was written in Sanskrit, probably on manuscripts the first time or early on, manuscripts like the one you see in this photo, written on palm leaves or some other leaf and encoded. It was probably first written about 2,000 years ago. 200 CE is the common date used. And it is a set of compiled experiences. Saying that it's 2,000 years old isn't actually accurate because all of these ancient texts were, maybe not all, but I think most were first part of oral tradition. So they were first told and they were first relayed from, say, a teacher to a student before they were written down. Because it's ancient, there are a lot of I don't knows. If I say it was first written in 200 CE, there's somebody else that says 400 or says 300 BCE. We also are not totally clear on the author, traditionally said to be Patanjali. Sutra means thread. These are written in a very terse verse style. It probably reinforces that idea that they were the essence of the teaching was written down. And it is a very difficult form to codify and then decodify. In other words, many of the verses do not mean something on the surface that's easily grasped. So there are, and there was from the very beginning, many commentaries on the Yoga Sutras. In fact, if you go to a store and you want to buy the Yoga Sutras, if you buy something that's 20 pages, you probably have the Yoga Sutras. But most of the books have 100, 200, 300, 500 pages. So that's all commentary and information to elucidate the sutras. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of translations of the Yoga Sutras in many languages. And having read a fair amount in English, I can tell you some of the translations are much better than others, I think, simply because we tend to, or people tend to translate from their own point of view, sometimes with an intent that's a little different than what the sutras was. So I say that with a word of caution when you choose a translation to read. I have 3 translations I truly love. One is Iyengar's translation. Iyengar was a teacher in the 20th century who taught many of the Western teachers, and it's quite a beautiful, readable translation. The second, and probably my favorite, is Ravi Ravindra's translation, which came out only probably 8-10 years ago. A beautiful, rich translation that's accessible for everybody and yet has an immense amount of depth to it. And the third one, especially if you're interested in Indian philosophy and culture and learning and how the Yoga Sutras embedded in all the other learnings of Indian philosophy, is Taimni's translation of the Yoga Sutras. Taimni was a scientist. He did many writings on the ancient text, very knowledgeable, and many of his texts are published by the Theosophical Society. The Yoga Sutras has 4 chapters. We're going to touch on 3 of them very, very briefly. The first chapter is Samadhi, which is the highest level of practice. Chapter 2 is largely about a varied amount of practices, including ethics, how to actually become a yoga practitioner, you might think of it. Third chapter is not entirely, but partially about what happens when you use these practices and tools in service of something. If you aim that laser focus at something, what happens? And chapter 4 is I think, very beautiful, very mysterious to me. It's about the last moments, if you will, of a yogi as the thought stream unwinds, time unwinds, and freedom is attained. I want to remind you that all of these are words. Words are symbols. They're not the experience itself, although they can inspire experience. The Yoga Sutras is thought to be the compilation of many experimenters. And I have this kind of an image in my head of ancient days and seers after a day of work sitting to explore what is in their mind, what is the greater universe of consciousness. There's a word phenomenology that's used in both philosophy, it's used in psychology, there's a form of psychology around it, and also in research. And it means entering into the experience. So not learning about it, not kind of swimming above it as an academic might do, not analyzing it, but entering into the experience. And so the Yoga Sutra invites us to enter into that experience. There's a lovely poem by a 15th century mystic, Kabir. He says that the holy pools have only water. There's nothing but water in the holy pools. I know, I've been swimming in them. And all the gods, sculpted of wood and ivory, they can't say a word. I know, I've been crying out to them. The sacred books of the East are nothing but words. What this writer talks about is what he has lived through. And if you have not lived through something, it is not true. So I take this as meaning not that the books are not valuable, but again, without the practice, without the intensity of entering into the experience, they're just something to put in our bag of knowledge. They don't go any further. I found when I was writing about the Yoga Sutras that it was really kind of interesting to look at the timeline. Many of these words and text would be familiar to you. We talk about the Indus Valley civilization. Harappa is one of the sites that was dug, and it's in northwestern India and Pakistan area, I think mostly in Pakistan, what we call Pakistan today. There was an immigration of Indo-Aryans about 1,000 years later. So when we talk about the Indus Valley civilization, we're talking 5,000 years ago. And out of this, and many controversies, I'll leave it there, but out of this came what we know as the Vedic era, and the Vedas themselves, followed by the Upanishads, which are very beautiful philosophical, mystical text, which was followed by the historical Buddha, which actually originated in northern India. Alexander the Great trekked through India and left many things, but one of the things that he left were craftsmen. And so for me personally, one of the most beautiful, some of the most beautiful sculptures, Buddhist sculptures, are done by craftsmen with both an eye for Greek form and for the Buddhic art. We have the epic period, Ramayana, Mahabharata, which are very valuable, very important to Indian culture, and about what is valuable, how do we live. And then after all of this, we get to the Yoga Sutras and the Sankhya-karika. And the Sankhya-karika is the classical form of Sankhya. A few hundred years later, we begin to read about Advaita Vedanta, and much of the Theosophical material is written from this perspective, this philosophy. The Tantric text started mostly from about 1200 Common Era, so they're much later. They have a breakaway from the classical yoga text, and they almost always involved their own text, their own guru. So they were very much about relaying knowledge from one to another. When we say that yoga is 5,000 years old or 4,000 years old, I've heard that many times. A lot of it comes back to a couple of references. One is this image. It's a seal. It's actually a very small seal found in Harappa, where it seems to, and I would, with my limited knowledge, I would agree that it seems like it is Shiva, or a prototype of Shiva as the lord of the animals, and you can see the animals around the figure. And this was created 4,000 to 3,000 years ago. So we have some of these images. This is not the only one. There are a couple of them. And then we also have references especially in the Upanishads of yoga. So this is the little breadcrumbs, if you will, that help trace the lineage of yoga. So what is the purpose of yoga? The purpose of yoga is the complete absence of confusion or ignorance about who we are. I love that statement. It's just complete absence of confusion. It's discriminating between what is real and what is transitory. The word used in the Yoga Sutras is kabaya, which means often translated as aloneness, which I understand why it's translated like that, but it's hard to grasp the first time. It really is freedom from that personality, from the ego, and it's really the aloneness of not being confused about who we really are. That inner self is who we are, not the clothes that we put on. The image there is Patanjali. So Patanjali most likely was a person who wrote down the experiences. And in this particular representation of Patanjali, we see him as part of the Hindu tradition. We see him as an incarnation of the Serpent King, whose coils represent infinity. Almost always there is a canopy over his head. I always think of that as like a cobra canopy, which is protection. And often with multiple heads, which is omnipresence. And the three coils, almost always three coils, so I've seen 7 too, are around, might relate or probably relate to the sounds of Om. So in this representation of Patanjali, he is seen as part of the lineage. There's great authority. There's that sense of orthodoxy, the orthodox philosophy, part of yoga, part of India, part of Hinduism. And there are ties to all of that. So what does the Yoga Sutras tell us about what yoga is? This is a cover of Ravi Ravindra's translation I wanted to show you. There are several definitions in the Yoga Sutras. I'll give you these 3, the most common ones. Yogas chitta vritti nirodha, which is yoga is the process of ending ordinary fluctuations of the mind. It's translated many ways. Yoga is a calm mind, things like this. I think a key word in here is process. It is not a lightning bolt. It is a process of practice and working towards the ends that we've talked about. It's also another definition is that it is intense discipline, self-study, not just reading from texts, but reading from texts and studying self in light of those sacred scriptures. And a devotion towards Ishvara. Ishvara is Lord, you could translate it as God. And that devotion is a way of focusing on that divine or that spiritual or that true self. The third translation or the third definition I've given you is that yoga is stillness of mind, which results from practice and not attachment and non-attachment. If we think about it, if we were never attached to anything, the mind would be pretty silent. And so that ability to not be like the elephant, be called by the bananas, by the carts, by the activity in the street, but to stay on the path, not being attached to even life itself. is the stillness of mind we call yoga. Samadhi is the first chapter of the Yoga Sutras. Samadhi is the ultimate meditation, if you will, the ultimate practice. It's not the goal, although that's sometimes confused. It's the actual practice. Its meaning actually is something around placing together. In the Yoga Sutra, Sanyama is a combination of fixing attention, holding the attention there for sustained periods, and samadhi. The samadhi piece of that is the point at which the focus of meditation is so thoroughly examined on the gross level, on the subtle level, and then it's like the ego slips away and there is a merging of the object of meditation with the self. Samadhi is said to happen after much practice. I also think that sometimes we can get a taste. I think sometimes we're too hesitant to think that that's the ego again, that this little ego can ever reach the heights of samadhi. So I think it's important to have taste along the way so they inspire us. So see if this works for you. It's a little experiment. And in that sense, it's very much yoga. I want you to think of a tree. You might pick one of those trees in the photo here, or you might pick a tree that's in your vicinity. We have thoughts about trees. Maybe they're fairly neutral, or maybe you're passionate about trees. So take a moment to just examine your thoughts about trees in general. And stay with it. And slightly refocus your thoughts to a specific tree. One in your yard or one you know of. Or maybe a symbolic tree or an imaginary tree. And take time to notice what the tree is like, what it means to you. And then dive into the tree. What does it consist of? What is the smell of the tree or the sense of the tree? The movement of the tree inside. The growth of branches, the rooting of the tree into the soil, maybe touching other roots. We'll take a few moments of silence. Stay with the tree. Stay there. And then let your mental discussion about the tree start to soften. As if you had a volume, you could just turn it down and start to lose the distinction between you and the tree for a moment. You may even have a sense of a little bit of merging, becoming that tree. And if you have a sense of that, notice the peace or stillness that arises. And then take a deep breath. Come back to the room. I hope you got some taste of that. Of course, the practice of meditation and samadhi is much more involved and deeper. And yet I do think there are points of contact for us. Taimni, one of the translators I mentioned, says that a person who comes out of true samadhi brings with him transcendent knowledge, wisdom, peace, strength of inner life, while others return no wiser, as if from sleep. So it's almost like, I love this quote because it's almost like a way of tracking. Does that stay with me? How many times have I meditated and then it left me 5 seconds after I stood up? So can I bring that out of the seat and into the life? And that's a test of samadhi, I think. I just want to mention a few things from the 2nd chapter and the 3rd chapter. Ashtanga is probably one of the most familiar words of yoga. It's the 8 practices or 8 limbs of yoga. And these start with ethics. They don't start with learning tree posture or learning some stretch. They start with ethics. And they include postures and breath regulation and the practice of withdrawing the senses so we're not led around by the senses. And then the 3 layers of meditation. And also in the 2nd chapter are ways of living with self and others, and also from the 1st chapter too. So we'll look at first the ethics. It came to me not long ago. I was working with a company on developing their internal statement of values, and I've always thought of ethics as something like this standard, and could be my own background, but I could never live up to it. Could I ever truly be nonviolent? Could I ever truly be truthful all the time? You know, that it just seems like a little bit of failure just to start with. And yet, when I think about it as what I value, I do value non-harming or non-violence. A value is something that directs our decision-making and thus directs our actions. So it stands above the conscious mind that goes, I need to do this, or I should do this, or this is driving me to do this. It sits above there and goes, in light of this value, does that decision make sense? So the ethics or the values, if you want to think of it like that, are 10 in yoga. These are repeated in many other Indian texts in many different ways, in many Buddhist texts, they overlap. And these 10 have both an external and an internal manifestation. So non-harming, ahimsa, could be thought to be not beating somebody up, not kicking something, not being angry all the time. So that external non-harming. But as a therapist, I have worked much more with the internal harm that we do inside, with our violent thoughts often directed towards ourselves as well as other people. The yamas, the self-regulation, how we regulate ourselves to prepare us for yoga, and the observances, the practices that start us on the path, if you will. So if you think about santosha, contentment, well, that could be externally around being content with the kind of environment we live in, with what we have. But internally, it might also be that sense of gratitude for having a life on the planet, for being where we are. That sense of gratitude is like the opposite of harming and violence, and is a way of true contentment, I think. So each of these is worthy of probably a lifetime of study, maybe 2 lifetimes. Certainly, ahimsa is the foundation for all of this. In the first chapter, we talk about samadhi, and one of the guidelines is how to live with people and foster that calm mind. And the first instruction is to be friendly, have an attitude of friendliness towards people that are happy. In other words, if somebody is happy, be happy with them. Share that positivity, if you will. If somebody is unhappy, have compassion. So what do you do when you meet somebody who's unhappy? Or is it circumstances that are dire? What is your natural inclination? And the third is delighting in the virtuous and positive acts of others. So for me personally, this has been a learning edge. Being able to delight in others' successes rather than being jealous or competitive about it was a really important learning for me. Not for everyone, but it certainly was for me. And I think this is probably hard for most of us, especially if we're concerned about life on the planet. How to notice when there's vice or something bad going on. And instead of judging, actually detach from the feelings. It doesn't mean, I don't think, that we don't act in service of something better, that we don't act in service of our compassion. But it does mean that we step away from that, I'm right, they're wrong, and I'm going to show them that they're right, they're wrong, and I'm right. So it's that it's that acting with detachment. And this is the verse 133. We are just going to light for a second on the third chapter, which is in part describes what you might call supernormal powers. It's after the perfected practice of fixed attention, concentration, absorption, samadhi. The powers of attainment or siddhis are around what happens when I set my focus there. And the knowledge is great of past or future lives, of others' thoughts, of foreknowledge of death, of the subtleties of the mind, knowledge of the cosmos, the ability to reduce hunger and thirst, all of these powers which are above and beyond what we would normally experience. And some writers and some commentators dismiss this, frankly, as silliness. I think that there's a reason the third chapter is there. I think it's to inform us and perhaps to let us know that there are signposts about where we put our attention. It might be to inspire us, and it might be to warn us that where we put our intention and attention is what we might get. Sustained attention is the main power of transformation. We avoid this transformation in everyday life because we set the intention with our common mind, our everyday mind. And then we get distracted by the phone or this or that. It's not sustained. So when we read about these powers or attainments, they're all about that sustained attention. Let's try an experiment. This will teach you a little bit about how easy this is or how hard this is for you. I want you to pick something you might want in your life. And be careful. Pick something that you might really want. And then focus for a minute. Talk about it to yourself. Imagine, but be careful. Stay focused. Don't go away. Stay right there. How easy or hard was that for you? It was probably less than half a minute. If you're curious about this, try it on your own. Pick something that's important to you and stay with it. We know that many of what I might say are the evils of the world come from people that can focus that well. So it's a tool. It is a practice. It is not the ultimate goal of the Yoga Sutras. So where have we been in this hour? We've talked a little bit about history, a little bit about yoga. Hopefully you have a sense of, at least from my interpretation, what the purpose of yoga is. The focus on stilling and quieting and bringing that inner peace. And the fact that it's not all about meditation. It is how we live. It is how we live with ourselves, which is not secret from anyone else, and how we live with others. I'm going to close with a beautiful poem from Rumi. Be melting snow. Wash yourself of yourself. A white flower grows in quietness. Let your tongue become that flower. Thank you all.